Welcome back. You're listening to Patriarch, the retelling of the biblical story of Abraham by me, Colin Piper. I wrote Patriarch, and I have to tell you that this particular podcast you're about to listen to was without doubt the most awkward and probably the saddest of the whole book. It tells of the flaws of humanity and the terrible consequences of compromise. Patriarch, Chapter 4, Part 2. The morning of the agreed day, Sarai woke abruptly from sleep, deeply disturbed. She dreamt again of the unusual family of herself, Abram, Hagar, and the child. This time, though, the positions were changed. Hagar held the child and stood by Abram's side while she stood in the shadows behind. It was a simple picture, but one which troubled her throughout the day. She sought to busy herself first with her routine and later with preparations for the evening, and yet the picture lingered. It was etched on the wall of the tent as she rose. It was acted out under the tree on the horizon as she emerged from the tent, and people she met incidentally throughout the day assumed the characters and fulfilled their roles. Sarai responded, outwardly at least, by throwing herself even more enthusiastically into the plan. Oddly, in a role reversal, she played the part of maidservant to Hagar and prepared her as a bride on her wedding night. In a display of commitment to the cause and trust in the participants, she determined to go the extra mile. If it was an attempt to laugh off the taunting dream as ridiculous, it failed. In the event, her actions only further developed the picture now dominating her mind. As she bathed and perfumed Hagar, the vision of the young beauty standing before her with her attractive flat belly and firm, defined curves and gloriously soft skin was translated into the increasingly sensual picture of her dream. At the same time, in the picture, she became ever more distant in a soft mist which gradually blurred out all except Abram and now naked Hagar and the baby. Sarah was so consumed by the vision that the unthinkable happened. She failed to sense her husband in the entrance to the tent. As soon as she did, though, her doubts vanished. Their time was up. The doubts had done their work, and there was no room left for them. They made way for realities, along with their resultant responsibilities and consequences. And Sarai now knew what she feared. And like others who see their mistake not after, but just before the impact of them, she stood frozen, helpless, and seemingly unable to prevent what was about to take place. Instead, she could only step quietly and slowly back into the shadows and leave Abram to be drawn to Hagar's nakedness and so complete the picture. The moment Abram had agreed to what Sarai said, something changed in him. It was as though a door had been opened in his life to reveal a room which had always been there, but he had somehow had existed unexplored. Or perhaps more aptly, something had come to life which had until then lay dormant. It was at first innocuous enough. The first time Abram went to Sarai's area after agreeing to sleep with Hagar was the first time he really saw Hagar. He went intrigued and came back self-consciously excited. Some power was being unleashed in his life, although at first Abram didn't think too much of it. He'd always been faithful to his Sarai, and his experience was that he wasn't like other men. Of course he had these feelings, but unlike them, he could control them, or at least his love for Sarai could. And so now, complacently, he allowed the feelings space to develop. They were, after all, exciting, but harmless and even justifiable, given what he'd been asked to do. In fact, if the truth be known, he did more than allow them. He indulged them by taking time to visit Sarai and see Hagar. What he saw stayed with him, and he began to imagine what he hadn't seen. Little by little, he found himself thinking more of Hagar and less of Sarai. He also found his reflections before his God were increasingly interrupted by thoughts of her too, and what was to come. He would feel guilty about it, but then he reminded himself he wasn't betraying either Sarai or his God. Indeed, far from it. He was serving both. And so indulgence paved the way for infatuation. The nearer the day came for which Sarai had told Abram to prepare, the greater the intensity of the feelings became. They were now not only consuming his thoughts, they were changing them. When Sarai had first approached Abram with the idea, he'd gone through an initial period of confusion. Then he quickly conjured up a happy picture of a joyful Sarai with a child, which he handed to her, having apparently been given it by a shadowy figure of a girl barely recognizable in the background. Rapidly, this picture had changed as Hagar had emerged from the shadows until the three of them stood together. Now Abram held the child, and Sarai held Abram appreciatively, while the maidservant looked on. Hagar was still a slight distance apart, but significantly never before had anyone else other than Sarai even featured in Abram's mind's eye. Again, Abram could justify Hagar's inclusion in his vision of the future because the way he saw it, Sarai would have wanted it. He was, though, increasingly both excited and uneasy about how he saw Hagar. Again and again he told himself he couldn't be unfaithful to Sarai if he was merely seeking to carry out her requests. The fact, though, he didn't ask himself, or more significantly still his God, about the rightness of that request, would have suggested that his reasoning was based more on excusing than explaining his thought processes. And still the excitement grew with anticipation, until there was no room left for self-examination at all. Abram found an energy he hadn't known in years. He sought more and more excuses to visit Sarai and see Hagar. But the effect wasn't to calm the excitement, but increase it, and until finally, when the day came, Abram could barely eat. If he dared be honest, he would have had to admit to himself that his excitement matched and surpassed anything he'd felt about coming before his God. Something which the Abram of old would never have believed possible. Finally, Abram couldn't wait until the appointed time and went to Sarai's tent early, intending to wait outside until bidden. However, as he stood outside in the cool, bright, moonlit air, he could hear the familiar sound of bathing water being poured over a body, and if he strained, he could make out the perfumed scent. What he heard and smelled excited him to seek out a further sense, that of sight. Oh, but he well knew that Sarai's tent would never allow such an opportunity, so he waited, straining his mental senses to make up for what his physical senses couldn't reveal. It wasn't long, however, before he found himself standing in the very entrance to the tent and manipulating the flap ever so slightly with his fingers to produce the slenderest of cracks through which to look. At first he could see little and needed to open the flap some more. He wondered briefly how Sarai hadn't sensed him there, but what he saw quickly snuffed out such irrelevant thoughts. Still, it was too little, and mostly Sarai blocked his view of the girl. He wished his wife would step back out of the way, but she seemed unnaturally absorbed in her unaccustomed role of bathing her maidservant. By now it was all too much for Abram, who suddenly became angry with himself. What was he doing lingering guiltily outside of his wife's tent? Wasn't he the patriarch? Couldn't he enter at will? Couldn't he do or have whatever he wanted? And with that, Abram aggressively threw back the flap, took one step and one look inside, and froze. What he saw would stay with him forever, and would unleash a desire he would never again fully tame. What he didn't see was his Sarai retreating into the shadows. Hagar had agreed to her mistress's wishes, not only out of a sense of duty, but also love. She could picture the day when she gave Sarai the baby she sought, with Abram standing behind, looking on appreciatively. It was a glorious picture, and one which saw her through the doubts and fears all young virgin brides felt. Abram visited her mistress a lot more these days, and although he never spoke to her humble maidservant, in fact, he appeared awkward around her, Hagar noticed how he looked at her, and it was different. It was now more like the way other men looked at her. But with one exception, it excited Hagar. Oh, to be noticed by men is one thing, but to be noticed by the patriarch himself, that's something quite different. She could tell her mistress was growing increasingly uneasy, however hard she tried to cover things up, and this disturbed her. But things were changing now, and she was enjoying the change. When the day came, she was nervous. And so was her mistress, whose casual, chatty energy didn't fool Hagar. For a brief, flickering moment, she despised her mistress for her stupidity. But almost immediately her love crushed the thought, and her heart went out to her, replacing it with another new emotion: pity. Again she found herself almost immediately rejecting the feeling. How could she, a humble maidservant and no one, feel pity for a matriarch? But then Sarai wasn't a matriarch, was she? And she, a humble maidservant, was about to be what her mistress could never be. Subtly her subconscious picture changed, and she no longer gave the baby to Sarai, but stood holding it, while Abram looked on just behind her, and further back still, Sarai. Again she rejected the thought guiltily, only for it to come back so much stronger that evening, when bizarrely and initially awkwardly for Hagar, her mistress undressed and bathed her. Now she was the mistress, awaiting the patriarch's love, and Sarai a mere servant and onlooker. She struggled to reject this thought quite as easily as previous ones. In fact, she indulged in it as Sarai poured perfumed water over her, and she lost herself in it until the water stopped being poured, and she turned to see Sarai retreating into the shadows, and Abram looking upon her nakedness. Sarai slept little that night. It was bright and quiet. At first she'd been all too aware of every movement from the adjoining section of the tent, and each muffled sound mocked her. Then it had gone quiet, and the silence mocked her too. She sought sleep, if only to escape the torment of her imagination, but only found it as dawn weakly broke the semi-darkness of the moonlit night. Then her imagination merely switched its attention from her conscious to her subconscious mind, and tormented her some more. Finally, she rejected the sleep she'd sought and started the day early. Now she sought in routine and busyness not just distraction, but assurance that things would be the same and not as she feared. But straight away she realized it would never be so. She rose quietly, without calling for the help of a maidservant of whose whereabouts she was uncertain, and more significantly didn't care to reflect upon. For the first time since she met the girl, she didn't want Hagar. She'd always anticipated needing to get a new maidservant, at least temporarily, during Hagar's confinement, but she wasn't anticipating this. How can a person you love so dearly become so easily and quickly a figure you can't bear even to see? Suddenly regret drained her sleep-deprived body of all energy, emotional and spiritual, and left her unable to lift her robe over her head. Her arms dropped to her side listlessly, and she felt the robe slipping from the loose grasp of her hands. But it didn't fall. It was taken, lifted, and gently placed over her head, and dropped over her trembling body. Slowly, reluctantly, nervously, Sarai turned her head towards Hagar and looked at those eyes she'd grown used to turning to for assurance, comfort, and energy. They were tired this morning, even bloodshot. But more than that, they were confused. They spoke of a love but an awkwardness, of an excitement but an uncertainty, of a loyalty but a pride. These were no longer the eyes of a maidservant, and Sarai knew Hagar no longer belonged to her either. She wondered to whom Hagar might now belong, and looked at and to her for an answer. Hagar, in response, dropped her eyes to the floor, reddened, turned, and hurried off. Abram woke alone. His first thoughts were of Hagar, and briefly exhilaration returned, but only briefly. Then they were swept away by a tidal wave of guilt. His mind went to Sarai as he sought to turn back the tide. He reminded himself that all he'd done for her, at her request, but this reasoning no longer worked. If his excitement, his ecstasy even, had been for Sarai, why could he never admit it to her, as he knew he couldn't? Even now the image of Sarai in his mind was being replaced by another, and Abram had to fight to prevent it. But it wasn't just Sarai with whom Abram was now struggling to be honest. Abram decided he could rightly be angry with God. After all, this was for him as much as for Sarai, and if God was so opposed to it, why didn't he say so? What sort of God allows you to go down the wrong path and then makes you feel guilty about doing so? And yet the guilt still came. Guilt punctuated with excitement and fought with indignation and self-pity. This wasn't a guilt Abram was prepared to bear. This time there would be no heart searching on crags and no muffled apologies. This time life would go on the same as before. Again images invaded his mind, and Abram hated himself for them until he reminded himself those images of Hagar were put there because of Sarai and were necessary to fulfill the call of God. And so when the images came again, Abram accommodated them up to a point. Hagar had returned to her tent, tired, aching, but glowing. She'd never known what to expect of the physical act and still didn't quite know what to think, but that night she'd become a woman, a lady. Gone was the child, the little maidservant. She had become someone, needed not just for the menial, but for the very essence of life itself. And more than that, she wasn't just needed, she was desired. She could sense it. She'd come to fill a void Sarai had been unable to fill in Abram's life, and left wondering just how big that void must have been. She had little time that night to contemplate what this might mean for her relationship with Sarai, as her exhaustion overwhelmed her with sleep. And the following morning she didn't think too much about it either. Her body woke her routinely, as it always did, and she went as she always went to her mistress's tent to await her waking. In fact, it wasn't until she was helping Sarai with her robe and Sarai turned towards her that the questions came. Her first concerns were for the lethargy of the woman she loved. She'd rushed to help out of love as much as out of duty. But then the doubts came. Why was this old woman better than her? Birth maybe placed her in a higher order, but what was that when you needed another to fulfill and apparently satisfy your husband? The thoughts were evil, and Hagar reddened in shame, and then hurried off in case her mistress could read her mind.
You're listening to the Patriarch podcast. For more information, you can go to BibleNovels.com, where you can become a Patreon supporter to support overseas mission.